The morning sun had just broken through the trees when Clara Foster set out with her basket of eggs. The trail down to the river was quiet, soft with dew and the scent of grass. The kind of silence that had comforted her for the past 3 years. Life since Eli's death had settled into a rhythm she didn't question, solitary. Modest. Untroubled. She preferred it that way. The world had taken too much already. She no longer waited for surprises. But then she saw it. At first, it was just a shape caught between 2 rocks in the bend of the river where the water turned slow and the trees leaned in like old men sharing secrets. It bobbed lightly, swaying with the current, wedged in place as though the river itself had carried it gently and then decided it had come far enough. Clara froze. She wasn't sure what she was looking at, just that it was out of place. Her boots sank into the mud as she stepped closer. Basket still tucked in the crook of her arm. The thing in the water looked wooden, aged, worn smooth by time and weather. A strange cold crept up her spine. A sensation like she was being watched. Though she knew no one ever came this far out. Her cabin sat alone in the Edgewood, miles from town, and that was how she liked it. Then she saw it more clearly. A cradle, a hand-carved one. The paint had long chipped away, and one of its legs was missing, causing it to tilt slightly in the shallows. But there it was, a baby's cradle, half submerged in the mud. Clara stared, rooted in place. It made no sense. Who would leave such a thing in the river? And why? She set the egg basket on the grass without looking. The act automatic, like she was under some spell. Her boots squelched in the mud as she stepped into the water. The hem of her skirt soaking instantly. A log bumped against her shin. But she barely noticed. Her eyes were locked on the cradle. And then she heard it. A sound so small, so weak, she almost thought she'd imagined it. A cry, thin, tired, not panicked, just weary, like the child had been crying for hours and had finally given up hope of being heard. Clara gasped. Her hands moved before her thoughts could catch up. She bent over the cradle, heart hammering, and there, nestled inside, was a baby. He couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. His skin was pale, cheeks blotched from the cold, and his little fists trembled slightly beneath a tattered quilt that smelled faintly of smoke and something bitter she couldn't quite place. Damp curls clung to his forehead, and when his eyes blinked open, they fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart stop. It was as if he knew her. Clara's arms moved instinctively, lifting him from the soaked cradle and holding him close to her chest. He was cold, not dangerously so, but enough that it made her clutch him tighter. She whispered soft nonsense sounds, trying to calm him, or maybe to calm herself. She wasn't sure anymore. Then she looked back into the cradle. What she saw next stole her breath. Beneath the quilt, half wrapped in rough cloth, was a knife, long, clean, and cruel-looking. Its presence felt wrong, unnatural, like it didn't belong near something so small and innocent. Clara's fingers trembled as she reached for the bundle. Beside the knife lay something even worse. A badge, brass, worn smooth with age, but unmistakable in its shape. She knew it before she even touched it. A sheriff's badge. And not just any badge. Her husband's badge. Sheriff Eli Foster. The name was etched right into the metal. Though faded, he'd been buried with full honors. Praised as a hero. Mourned by an entire town. Clara had worn black for a year. She'd stood beside his coffin, wept honest tears, and whispered prayers over a polished grave on Chapel Hill. She had believed, without question, that he had died protecting others. Until now, her mind raced. Why was his badge here? In a cradle? In the river? With a baby? She stepped back, the weight of the child now matched by a storm rising inside her. 1,000 thoughts came all at once, none of them making sense. Was this a warning? A threat? A mistake? She forced herself to breathe, staring at the initials carved faintly into the cradle's rail. CF. Her own. Clara Foster. Her maiden name. She nearly dropped the baby. Someone had wanted her to find this. Not just anyone, her. This wasn't an accident. This was a message, a carefully placed truth meant to shatter the lies she had spent years building her life around. And it had arrived in the arms of an infant. The river hadn't delivered a child. It had delivered a secret. Clara looked back down at the baby in her arms. His eyelids fluttered as he drifted into sleep. one tiny hand wrapped around the edge of her shawl. There was no trace of guilt or malice in him, only the soft vulnerability of new life. And yet, wrapped in that life was a question that cut deeper than the knife beside him. Who was this child? And what had Eli, her Eli, the man she had trusted, mourned, loved, done to bring him into the world and abandon him in a river? The breeze stirred the trees, and the cradle bumped gently against the rocks again, as if nudging her one last time. Clara stared out over the water, the baby safe in her arms, and knew that the quiet life she'd made for herself was over. Whatever this was, whoever this child might be, he was hers now, and so was the truth that came with him. And Clara Foster had never run from the truth. Not before, not now. The baby slept soundly on Clara's kitchen table, wrapped in the patchwork quilt she'd carefully dried by the fire. His tiny chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, a peaceful counterpoint to the chaos unraveling inside her mind. She hadn't moved much since bringing him in from the river. Everything had been too fast, too surreal. A cradle, a badge, a knife, and now, a name. She stood with the scrap of parchment in her hand. The note she'd pulled from the hem of the quilt, so cleverly hidden it was clear someone hadn't wanted it found unless absolutely necessary. The words were simple. If she finds him, tell her this child is innocent. But his father is not. Just one line, but it sliced through her like ice. Clara stared at it again, trying to will the meaning to change, trying to push away the terrible possibility that had already begun to take root. The handwriting, it was familiar. So familiar it made her stomach twist. There was a slant to it, a hurried curve to the T, the way the final word dragged like the pen had hesitated. She had seen it before. Eli. Her heart stuttered in her chest. No, she thought. No, Eli was. He was kind, steady, a lawman who loved justice. A husband who, though distant at times, had always kissed her forehead in the morning, had always worn the silver band she'd slipped on his finger under the chapel roof. He had died defending people. That was what everyone said. But then why was his badge here? Why was a baby wrapped in a quilt stitched with a hidden message? Why did the child have her initials on his cradle? Clara felt a dizzying nausea building behind her ribs. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself and forced her legs to move. Her hands dug through the trunk in the attic, an old cedar thing filled with memories she hadn't touched since the funeral. There was Eli's belt, his boots still caked with prairie dust. A few letters from the mayor. His personal cigar box. But what she was looking for lay beneath them all. Newspapers, clippings, posters. One in particular. She didn't know why she'd kept it. Maybe out of habit. Maybe because something about the woman's eyes had stuck with her even back then. She unfolded the page carefully. A wanted poster. Lorna Hale, accused of arson and theft, 22 years of age. There she was. Strong brows. Tired but defiant eyes. High cheekbones and a mouth that didn't quite smile. But it was what lay beside her in the picture that made Clara's blood run cold. A man. Barely visible. The photo grainy and torn. But there nonetheless. He was holding Lorna's hand. Clara brought the paper closer to her face, as if proximity might make the truth more bearable. But there was no denying it. The shape of his jaw. The slight wave of dark hair at the collar. The faint shadow of a badge gleaming on his chest. Eli. Her Eli. The same man who had sworn he never knew the woman. The same man who had sworn loyalty to her. Who had taken vows beneath God and their families. The same man buried in the town's highest hill with a grave polished weekly by the church elders. Clara's breath caught in her throat. A silent scream curled deep in her chest. She flipped the poster over. There were pencil markings, faint and nearly smudged with time. She read them slowly. She threatened to name me. Said the child would have foster blood whether I wanted him or not. I told her no one would believe her. It was his handwriting again. The same looped F. The same quick, impatient slant. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. But she blinked them away. She couldn't afford to cry. Not yet. He had lied. Not just about the child. About everything. He had used his title to silence a woman. He had tried to erase her existence. And now, years later, Clara was staring down the legacy of that erasure, a baby sleeping in her kitchen. A mother buried without a name. And a truth so ugly it made her skin crawl. She walked back to the child and looked down at him. He was innocent. She could see that now more clearly than ever. His dimple reminded her of Eli's. That part hurt more than she wanted to admit. But his eyes? His eyes were different. They held no trace of deceit. Only need. Only hope. Clara picked him up gently, rocking him against her shoulder as she whispered, "He tried to make you disappear." Her voice trembled. "But you're here. And I see you. I see you." And in those words, Clara made a quiet vow. She would not lie for a dead man. She would not protect the image of a husband who had betrayed everything she believed in. She would protect this child. Not because he was Foster's son. But because he wasn't. Not in the way that mattered. He wasn't the lie. He was the truth breaking through. Clara wiped her cheek roughly and stepped toward the fireplace, cradling the child in one arm and holding the poster in the other. She stared into the flames, and for a brief moment, considered tossing the past into the fire. But she didn't. The past deserved to be remembered. So no one else would forget. So no one else would be silenced. She folded the poster and placed it in the tin box where she now stored the letter and the badge. One secret at a time. She would carry it until she was strong enough to set it down. And this child, this boy who had arrived in a broken cradle with the river's whisper, he would not be defined by the mistakes of a man who had tried to vanish him. No, Clara would give him something better. A name, a future, a truth, even if it cost her everything. The wind on Chapel Hill was sharp that morning, stirring the tall golden grasses and lifting dust from the trail. Clara Foster climbed the slope slowly. Each step weighted not by the child sleeping against her chest, but by everything that had led her here, secrets, silences, sins that weren't hers to carry but had found her anyway. She hadn't set foot here in 2 years. The last time had been for Eli's birthday, flowers clutched in trembling fingers. Words whispered over a polished headstone. She hadn't known the truth then. She'd still believed in the illusion of the man beneath the ground. But that had changed. Now she carried no flowers. Only a knife, a wooden board, and a name. At the top of the hill. The grave was where she remembered it. Sheriff Eli Foster. Loyal, brave, loved. The words carved deep and sure. Set in stone by a town that never questioned what they were told. Clara looked down at the marker without expression. She had no tears left for that man, not now. Beside his grave, however, was something new. A patch of disturbed earth. Fresh, rain-darkened, unmarked, just a mound, slightly sunken. Clara had noticed it 2 nights ago. Walking back from the general store. She'd paused, stared, felt a tightening in her gut. No one in town had spoken of a burial. No ceremony, no procession, no preacher, just a grave. It hadn't taken her long to learn the truth. Lorna Hale, wanted woman. Erased mother. The child's protector, had died quietly. No one claimed her. No one spoke her name. So they buried her here. Beside the man who had silenced her. Clara stood between the 2 graves. The baby nestled against her in the sling. His breath warm on her collarbone. She crouched beside the unmarked earth. Brushed away a clump of dirt. And found what she was looking for, a small wooden stake. Half buried, it bore only 2 letters. Burned in crude strokes. L.H. Not even a full name. Not even the dignity of that. A long silence fell. Clara knelt, lowering the baby gently to her lap. He stirred, blinked once, and then nestled close again. Her hand rested on his back. Then she reached into her satchel and pulled out the board she had brought with her. The carving knife rested on top. She had spent half the night sanding the wood, smoothing it like she was preparing an offering. She had thought she would cry while doing this. But now that she was here, she didn't feel tears. She felt fire. A fierce, defiant fire. The same fire she imagined Lorna had carried. Walking through town with eyes watching. Judged for her name, her choices, her mere existence. A woman cast aside, forced to run, and finally buried without a word. Not anymore. Clara picked up the knife, braced the board against her knee, and began to carve. Lorna Hale. No dates, no epitaph, just her name, clear, bold, unapologetic. When she finished, she drove the marker deep into the soil, pounding it down with the heel of her hand until it stood firm. Then she sat beside the grave and took out the letter, the one slipped under her cabin door. The one written by Lorna before she died. She read it again, slowly. If my child lives, give him to the woman who once stood beside Eli Foster and didn't flinch. She'll know what to do. Clara folded it carefully and placed it beneath a stone at the foot of the grave. Then she spoke, low and steady. You weren't wrong to want more. You weren't wrong to run. You were just alone when no one should be. She looked down at the baby, Ben. She reminded herself, that's what Lorna had called him. Not Eli's son, not the child from the river. Just Ben. The name was simple, warm, whole, and it would be enough. She picked him up again, holding him close, feeling the weight of him, the heat of his life. His tiny hand reached up, fingers brushing her neck, his eyes searching her face. She smiled softly. I don't know what you'll grow up to be, Ben, she whispered, but I know what you won't be. You won't be hidden, you won't be erased, and you sure as hell won't carry the shame of a man who never deserved you. It was in that moment, sitting beside the grave of a woman the world had discarded, that Clara let go. She let go of the marriage she thought she had. She let go of the grief that no longer made sense. She let go of Eli Foster. Because the truth was, she didn't need his name to feel whole. She had her own. And now, so did Ben. As she stood to leave, she didn't look back at Eli's grave. She didn't need to. That story was finished. The stone could stay there, pristine and proud, but it no longer carried weight in her life. The wind picked up as she walked down the hill. Ben rapped against her chest. For the first time in years, the air didn't sting her eyes. It felt like breath, like new beginning, like choice. And when the town whispered, as she knew they wouldn't be talking about the dead sheriff anymore. They'd be talking about the woman who carved a name into silence and made a future from the wreckage of the past. Clara Foster had buried what needed to be buried. Now she would raise what deserved to live. It began with whispers. They started the moment Clara Foster crossed the wooden bridge into Red Hollow with a baby on her hip and fire in her eyes. She heard them, mutters behind curtains, gasps over market stalls, the rustle of gossip slipping faster than the wind. For 3 years, Clara had been a ghost to this town. A widow in black, silent and strange, tucked away in her cabin beyond the river bend. Now she walked through the square like a storm with a purpose. The child, wrapped snug in a clean quilt, clung to her side. He didn't cry, he didn't fidget. He watched the world around him with wide, steady eyes, calm in the eye of a brewing reckoning. Clara stopped first at the general store. The bell above the door rang as she stepped inside. Boots muddy from the trail, hair braided tight down her back. The shopkeeper glanced up from behind the counter, froze mid-gesture, and blinked as if he'd seen a ghost. Morning, she said evenly, setting a folded list on the wood. I'll need credit on these. He hesitated, glancing down at the child. What name should I put it under? Clara didn't flinch. Foster, the little one. There was a pause, a heartbeat where the air felt thick enough to break. Then, slowly, he wrote it down. She gathered her items without another word and stepped back onto the street. Next stop, the courthouse. She didn't knock. She didn't wait. She pushed the door open, walked past the startled clerk, and placed the baby gently on the desk. The boy looked up at her, then at the man behind the desk, and let out a soft hum. I'm filing for guardianship, Clara said. The clerk adjusted his spectacles, fumbling for a quill. Mother's name? He asked automatically. Lorna Hale, she said. Deceased. And the father? He continued, still not looking up. Clara's voice was quiet, but firm, irrelevant. The clerk paused. He glanced at her, then at the boy, and must have seen something in her eyes, something solid and unwavering. He didn't ask again. Instead, he flipped open the registry and began to write. And what name will the child carry? Clara looked down at the baby, her hand resting lightly on his back. Ben Foster, she said. That's what his mother called him. He'll carry my name until he's old enough to choose one for himself. She signed the papers with a flourish, her signature sharp and proud. No longer a name borrowed from grief. No longer a shadow of a man buried on the hill. Foster now meant something else entirely. When she stepped out into the square, the stairs were more direct. An old woman sitting by the well muttered a prayer under her breath. A young mother pulled her child a little closer. Two farmhands stopped mid-loading a wagon to watch her pass. Let them stare, Clara thought. Let them speak. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't hiding. She made her way to the church next. Inside, the pews were mostly empty. It was a Tuesday. The preacher sat near the altar polishing the brass lanterns. When he saw Clara, he rose slowly, smoothing his coat. "Clara," he said cautiously, "I wasn't sure we'd see you here again." "I'm not here for forgiveness," she replied, stepping past him. "I'm here to be seen." She walked to the front pew and sat down, the baby resting quietly in her arms. The preacher remained silent for a long moment before nodding. "You've been carrying a great deal," he said gently. "And I'll carry it as long as I need to," she answered, "but I won't carry it in secret." That Sunday, Clara returned. This time, she didn't sit in the back. She sat front and center, with Ben in her lap and her chin held high. When the preacher spoke of grace and redemption, he glanced down at her and smiled. "God sees those who stand in truth," he said, "even when the world pretends not to." The congregation squirmed, but no one said a word. Not aloud. The whispers never truly stopped. Some said she'd gone mad, taking in a bastard child from the river like it was hers to keep. Others claimed she'd stolen him, that the grief had finally cracked her mind. A few even dared to suggest she was covering up her own sins, rewriting the past in her favor. But Clara didn't answer them. She didn't explain herself. She walked to the market. She shopped for thread and baby shoes. She taught Ben to hum when she sang at dusk and let him tug on her braid until he giggled. She sat on her porch with him in her lap, telling him stories about a world he could grow into, one not built on silence and shame, but on strength and truth. And when someone asked, "Is he yours?" she always gave the same answer. "He is now." 3 words. 3 words strong enough to close mouths, change minds, and reclaim a name that had once been tarnished by lies. Clara Foster was no longer the sheriff's widow. She was Ben's mother, by choice, by love, by truth, and in that, she found more justice than 1,000 trials could offer. The world looked different now. Clara stood on the porch of her small cabin, barefoot in the early morning light, holding Ben close against her chest. The air was cool, touched by the fading breath of night, and the sky was brushed in soft pinks and golds, like someone had painted hope across the horizon just for them. She hadn't felt this kind of stillness in years, not the silence of grief or loneliness, but the stillness that came when the soul had nothing left to prove. Ben stirred in her arms, a gentle weight she had come to know better than her own heartbeat. He wasn't crying, just shifting, reaching a hand toward her collar as if reminding her he was there. "I know," she whispered. "We made it." She stepped into the dirt and crouched low near the porch rail. The storm from the night before had wiped away the letters she'd written in the dust. But she remembered every one. She reached down and began to trace them again, her finger carving softly through the earth. Ben. She spoke it aloud like a blessing, like a promise. Then she added a curve beneath it, her mark, a simple underline that said, "This name stays." Behind her, the old house creaked. The wood was aging, but still strong, like her. Like the bones of a life she hadn't expected to rebuild, yet now stood solid beneath her feet. Inside, bread rose in a tin bowl near the fire, and a half-finished journal sat on the table. Clara had begun writing in it not for herself, but for Ben, a record of laughter, of songs hummed at sunset, of first steps, of the moment he learned to say her name. She wanted him to know not just where he came from, but where he belonged. Outside, the barn door swung slightly in the breeze. The mule gave a sleepy snort. The hens were scratching lazily near the co-op. And somewhere in the trees, a bird sang the start of a new day. It was, by all accounts, a simple life, but it was hers, and more importantly, it was his. Ben, not the son of Eli Foster, not the river baby, not a question mark in a cradle. Just Ben. And he was happy. He had begun to smile at the sound of her voice. He laughed when she made silly faces or dipped her hand in the flour sack and tapped his nose. He babbled when she sang hymns at dusk. And he fell asleep each night curled into the crook of her arm, safe beneath a patched quilt that no longer smelled like smoke and fear, but like home. Clara carried his name to town now like a banner. Not a burden. She no longer wore black. She wore sky blues, soft greens, clothes she'd sewn herself with strong thread and stronger hands. And when people asked, "Is he yours?" she always gave the same answer. "Yes, he is." There was no shame in her voice anymore. No apology. Just pride. The townsfolk had started to change too. Not quickly, not all at once, but enough. The preacher had begun calling him Ben Foster during Sunday services, even pausing once to say, "God bless the boy with the brave name." The shopkeeper no longer hesitated when she asked for credit, and a few mothers had even begun letting their children wave when they passed on the road. Whispers still came, of course. Some people couldn't help themselves. But Clara no longer flinched from them. She let the words pass over her like wind through the trees. She knew the truth, and more importantly, Ben would grow up knowing it too. She had buried Eli's badge. She had carved Lorna's name into the earth. She had written her own story from the pieces left behind. Now, every breath she took was a line in that new story. And Ben? Ben was the heart of it. That afternoon, while the bread cooled and the baby napped in the sling across her chest, Clara sat at the table and opened the journal again. She flipped to a clean page, dipped her pen, and began to write. "Today, you laughed so hard. You scared the hens." She smiled as she scribbled. "You tried to eat a feather. I stopped you. You cried. Then you burped. I laughed. You laughed too." She paused, pen in hand, and looked down at him. His hand was curled against her chest, mouth slightly open in sleep, lashes casting shadows on his soft cheeks. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. "You'll grow up strong," she whispered, "not because of what your blood gave you, but because of what love made of you." She closed the journal and placed it gently on the shelf, next to the Bible, a bottle of lavender oil, and the first shoes she'd ever sewn for him. Outside, the sun dipped low, the sky flamed orange and red, and the world glowed with the kind of light that made everything look like it had been touched by grace. Clara stepped onto the porch again, barefoot, Ben warm against her. She didn't think of the river anymore, or the lies buried beneath headstones. She thought of the dirt beneath her feet, the future in her arms, and the name that now meant something different. Foster. Once, it had belonged to a man who broke things. Now it belonged to a boy who would grow things. And a woman who had chosen to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. Clara looked to the sky, then down at the baby. "Let them talk," she murmured. "We've got living to do." And with that, she turned inside, the lamp flickering in the window, the stew warming on the stove, and the sound of Ben's breath syncing with her own. It wasn't the life she had expected. It was better, because it was theirs.